China and Russia vowed to create a new multipolar world order, accusing the West of undermining global stability as both countries push back against the United States' hegemony. Following its major diplomatic breakthrough between Iran and Saudi Arabia, could Beijing be cast in a new role as global mediator and power broker? Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Rida Fakhri. China and Russia accuse the West of undermining global stability as Presidents Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin met in Moscow this week in a show of public defiance towards the United States, with both leaders vowing to work together to build, quote, a more just and democratic multipolar world order based on international law and the principles enshrined in the Charter of the United Nations. As he concluded a three-day state visit to Russia, President Xi said Chinese-Russian ties are of vital importance for the modern world order and the fate of mankind, while President Putin described the bilateral relationship as being at the highest point in the entire history of the two countries.
Предлагаю тост за здоровье нашего друга, уважаемого председателя Китайской Народной Республики, господина Си Цзиньпиня. За здоровье всех членов китайской делегации, за углубление российско-китайского всеобъемлющего партнерства и стратегического взаимодействия, за процветание и благополучие народов России и КНР.
我相信，在双方共同努力下，中俄关系这棵参天大树一定会更加枝繁叶茂。
Joining me now to discuss the shift in great power politics is Mitchell Reese, Director of Policy Planning at the U.S. Department of State between 2003 and 2005. Mitchell Reese, Beijing and Moscow are clearly displaying a united front against the West in general and the United States in particular. Their vision is clear: a new multipolar world, a new international world order, without letting Washington continue to dictate its terms on the world. Are we at the cusp of a new international world order without the United States in the lead?
I don't think so, but I think there are certain challenges that we've seen that will make it more challenging for the United States to lead, not dictate, but rather to lead the international order that it helped create after World War II. What we saw with China and the Russian visit this past week was a very dominant China and a subservient Russia. Russia's clearly the junior partner here. They were not able to get the second pipeline through Siberia in order to make up for some of the lost economic revenue of shipping energy to Europe. The Chinese didn't promise anything new. The United States is watching very clearly about lethal armaments being supplied by Beijing. So again, this is a culmination of trends with China simply becoming more powerful economically, militarily, and now stepping out a little bit more diplomatically on the world stage.
Does Washington today have to accept that it is no longer the indispensable state that it once was, that American exceptionalism is coming to an end?
Well, I still believe personally that the United States is exceptional for many, many reasons. I think that as long as there are lines outside American consulates all over the world for people to get visas to come visit the United States, that's a measure of how attractive we are as a country. But it's a more complicated world now, and we are learning that it's better to have friends and allies around the world. That's what we've been trying to do now for the last few years. And we've seen that not only in Asia, but also the Europeans have rallied to help the Ukrainians. And so I think, again, this is one of the secrets of America's success. It builds alliances. It doesn't have to fight alone. It doesn't have to enter diplomatic negotiations alone. It has friends and allies, and China doesn't.
But the fact that the U.S. has to compete with Moscow for its close ally, Saudi Arabia, says a lot, doesn't it?
Well, I'm not sure that that's a zero-sum type of competition either. I think the Saudis have shown a deftness and sophistication in their diplomacy in the last 6 months, a year or so, that we didn't see before. And I think that what they're trying to do is to a couple of things. I think, first of all, is to stabilize their neighborhood so that they can realize the Vision 2030 that Riyadh and the Crown Prince has set out and articulated so clearly. And I think they also want to see if they can cut their losses in Yemen and bring an end to that war and that humanitarian catastrophe.
But the fact that some countries, including your once staunch ally, Saudi Arabia, turned to Beijing, not to Washington, to broker a deal, is that a measure of the United States, not just its declining influence, but also its lack of credibility when it comes to brokering agreements?
Well, unfortunately, I think there may be a little bit to that. And American credibility, I think, took a hit in terms of the perceptions in the region when we did not support Hosni Mubarak during the Arab Spring. I think it then increased when President Obama's red line was crossed with impunity in Syria. And I think also the Saudis saw themselves being attacked by Iranian cruise missiles in their oil fields, and the Trump administration didn't respond to that. So I do think that there has been some diminution of American credibility and reliability, and so the Saudis are hedging their bets.
But isn't a big factor in this decline in America's influence it's double standards? You served in the George W. Bush administration 20 years ago, and this week we just marked the 20th anniversary of the United States' illegal invasion of Iraq. To what extent would the invasion of Ukraine have happened if the invasion of Iraq hadn't?
Well, first of all, this is your characterization of the U.S. involvement in the Iraq War, not mine. I'm not sure that one has anything to do with the other. I think you're making an argument that there was an erosion of international norms that the United States led with by Iraq, and therefore it follows that Putin had it easier invading Crimea in 2014 and then Ukraine last year.
The war wasn't sanctioned by the United Nations.
That's correct. That's correct. And neither was Putin's invasion. Neither are lots of wars and conflicts all over the world. It doesn't necessarily follow that there's causation between one to the other.
But do you agree that the invasion was illegal? Therefore, the fact that there were no consequences might have led us to the situation we're in today. A lot of people have made a link between the two.
Well, I think the United States felt that it had legal justification for going into Iraq. It did not get the second UN resolution that we wanted. Again, I think that it's easy to draw analogies between the two, but I don't see them as being similar at all.
Is it wise, would you say, for Washington to say that the time isn't ripe for a ceasefire? To keep throwing weapons into this conflict instead of trying actively to find a diplomatic solution to it?
Well, again, the United States has a role to play, but ultimately it's going to be up to Moscow and to Kiev to decide when or if they want to stop fighting. Right now, it doesn't appear that there's a willingness on either side to stop, and unfortunately, the war continues.
But the fact that the U.S. has warned China not to sell weapons to the Russians, while we continue to see this huge flow of U.S. weapons to Kiev, isn't there at the very least some hypocrisy here?
No, I think that the Ukrainians are clearly the victims of Russian aggression. And so, therefore, it's natural that the United States, and not just the United States, all the European countries are also helping the Ukrainians and the Japanese as well. So I think that there's rather a broad coalition. It's not the United States against China here.
You say there's a broad coalition, but according to a recent survey conducted by the Economist's intelligence unit, support for Russia in the developing world has actually grown. More countries are now siding with Moscow in its war against Ukraine, countries that account for some 33% of the world's population. And more countries are taking a neutral stance. They represent 31% of the global population. It's not necessarily that they support Russia's invasion, but they seem to appreciate that the conflict isn't between good and evil. It isn't black and white.
Well, I think they're entitled to their opinion. Of course, that's not the way that we see it. I think that some of the more astute governments are trying to play off both sides against the middle here to try to position themselves so that they can take advantage of inexpensive Russian oil and energy, like the Chinese and the Indians are doing. That doesn't necessarily mean that they're supporting Russia. It just means that they're taking advantage of a situation. So I'm not sure that I would draw any large or enduring conclusions from that.
Mitchell Reese, former Director of Policy Planning at the U.S. State Department, thank you very much.
My pleasure. Thank you.
In an agreement brokered by China earlier this month, Saudi Arabia and Iran agreed to resume diplomatic relations after decades of tensions and open hostility, with Saudi Arabia's King Salman extending an invitation this week to Iran's President Ibrahim Raisi to visit Riyadh. The agreement between the two regional rivals was announced in Beijing on March 10th. The unexpected diplomatic tour de force, which has cast China in a new role as global mediator, took the United States by surprise. The breakthrough follows a meeting last month in Beijing between President Xi Jinping and Iran's President Raisi. Xi had also met with Saudi leaders in Riyadh in December. While publicly welcoming the agreement, the White House rejected the notion that Beijing's growing political clout in the region could replace Washington's waning influence. So how have China's growing economic ties with countries in the region shaped its role as mediator? China is the world's second largest economy, accounting for 18.5% of global GDP. The US share is almost 13%. India accounts for almost 9%. Since 2010, Beijing has replaced Washington as the Middle East's largest trading partner, with energy at the core of the trade relationship. The region accounts for nearly half of China's oil imports, most of it from Saudi Arabia. In 2020, Beijing imported $176 billion worth of crude oil from the region. At the end of 2021, the bilateral trade volume was worth $87.3 billion, a more than 200-fold increase since diplomatic relations were established more than 3 decades ago. In 2021, 27% of Saudi oil exports went to China. China has been Iran's main trading partner since 2010. In 2021, the two countries signed a 25-year strategic agreement to strengthen economic and security cooperation. Iran's trade with China reached almost $16 billion in 2022. That's up 7% from the previous year. China's crude oil imports from Iran reportedly set a new record last year. Saudi Arabia was China's largest oil supplier in 2022, selling over 87 million tons of crude. Russia overtook Saudi Arabia to become China's top oil supplier in the first 2 months of 2023. So what does Beijing's role in bringing together two of the region's key geopolitical adversaries and political foes say about the region's shifting dynamics and strategy? Could China's Middle East breakthrough lead to other diplomatic successes? Joining me now to discuss this is Shanshan Zhao, Professor of International Relations and Chair of the Asian Studies Research Council at American University, and Zuri Linersky, a research fellow with the Eurasia Group Foundation. Professor Zhao, how surprising was it for you to see China broker this rapprochement between Iran and Saudi Arabia, these two arch enemies? What was the main factor that led to this successful diplomacy, in your opinion?
I would like to say yes or no. Indeed, because that's a 4-day secret negotiation in Beijing. Nobody knows. So in that case, a bit surprised to see the development. But on the other hand, we know China has engaged in Middle East for a long time. Prior to that, Xi Jinping visited Saudi Arabia and meeting with leaders, and also inviting Iran president to Beijing, had a long negotiation and conversation. So in that case, making China in a good position to be a mediator for the two Middle East. And also China has a huge stakes in Middle East, not only economic, but also strategic, political, and diplomatic fronts.
Zuri Linersky, the Saudi-Iran deal was reportedly 2 years in the making, with secret talks taking place in Iraq and Oman. And one might argue that the United States inadvertently laid much of the groundwork. But at the end of the day, did China have something that the United States lacked with all parties, which is greater credibility?
Certainly, the United States is increasingly viewed as not an even broker in the region. Its policies towards Israel, those have been kind of declawed in the region because of the Abraham Accords. And then its enduring policies towards isolating and sanctioning Iran put it in a position that it can't exert equal leverage throughout the region. Even in the Abraham Accords, which normalized ties between Israel, the UAE, Bahrain, Sudan, and Morocco, they don't extend to Saudi Arabia. So it's unclear how the United States really could have pushed these two actors together, although it has been advocating for ratcheting down tensions in the region for some time. So there is a lack of credibility from the American side.
Do you agree that the Chinese government and the Chinese leader filled that credibility gap?
Indeed.
That the United States could no longer be seen and couldn't be seen for quite a few years as an honest broker in the Middle East and now in Ukraine and in the Asian context as well, with the Asia-Pacific, Taiwan situation?
Exactly, that's the case. That is, there has been declining in terms of credibility of the United States, simply because it cannot be a trustful partner to every party. Because if you want to be a mediator, you have to be trusted by two sides. In this case, how could you expect that Iran would trust the United States and among others? And China, on the other hand, had a practice not intervene other countries' internal politics, and also engaging primarily economic activities. So in that case, China gained certain credibility. That's the foundation for this time of success.
For China, of course, it's important to have stability in the region because it increases its commercial ties with many important countries, not to mention the energy dimension to all of this. But looking back, Zuri, the Nixon-Kissinger doctrine was to keep the Soviet Union out of the Middle East by propping up, at the time, Iran and Saudi Arabia. After 10 years, the United States lost Iran. Iran became an enemy. Is Washington now losing Saudi Arabia as an ally?
That's a great question, and I think the answer is probably no. I think it's becoming apparent that the Saudis are playing a bit of a double game. They're playing China and the United States off one another to get as much as they can. So in terms of trade and investment, China is incredibly valuable to the Saudis. But at the same time, the United States is their security guarantor, right? While the Chinese have an incredible arsenal of weapons that they might be able to sell to the Saudis, currently the Saudi government and the Saudi military depend almost exclusively on American-made equipment. That's notwithstanding the drone base, the drone facility and the military facility that the Chinese will be building. So I think we're seeing kind of a distribution of influence, kind of the rise of a more multipolar or system in which there are multiple players in the region, and the Saudis are exerting their own influence and their own agency.
The Saudis are clearly balancing their security off by playing the United States against China. Is Washington now accepting this new reality that it is no longer the only indispensable player in the region, and will any kind of pressure on Iran now have to take into account Beijing's interests?
First of all, I agree with Zuri's argument that there is a multipolar structure in the making in the region. Secondly, Iran and other Middle East powers now is getting closer to China compared to decades ago, simply because not only China itself has a huge economic power, but also those other Middle East countries, they also developed economic partnership with China, like with one.
So how will that affect U.S. pressure on Iran?
Well, I would say that the United States has to, because Middle East also a key region for strategic interest of the United States, even though with oil elements now reduced. But that I would say that would making Washington reconsider its Middle East policy, and in particular, how to deal with different powers.
And speaking about how to deal with different powers, Zuri, we focused on the United States a lot, but the other big loser when it comes to the new Saudi-Iran relationship is Israel. Can Washington afford to continue its blind support for the Israeli government, its position towards Palestinians, given this new reality?
So I think there's 2 points to be made here. First is that there's an open question as to how Israel views this. It's not clearly bad for Israel for this deal to have gone through, because it might actually make it easier to get a relationship moving forward with the Saudis. Now, at the same time, it really complicates things in the kind of larger geopolitical struggle between Israel and Iran. The unfortunate consequence of this deal between Saudi Arabia and Iran is that the Palestinians are in fact the major losers, because it's made very clear that peace between Israel and Israel and its neighbors will not include the Palestinians, and it's become more apparent that a lot of the regional players like Saudi Arabia are relatively out of time and out of patience with the PA. And they have more time to work with Israel, which is a major economic powerhouse, as demonstrated by the Abraham Accords.
But the Israeli government presumably cannot be happy with this rapprochement, given the way it feels about the Iranian government, the fact that it's put so much pressure all these years on the US government to take an aggressive stance towards Iran.
I think it's a mixed bag. I don't think they're happy, but I also think they see an opportunity. And at the same time, we have to remember that its security is tied to that of the United States. That in 2025, Israel is expected to get KC-25 refueling tankers that'll actually facilitate a potential attack on Iran. So this actually is an interesting moment in geopolitics of the region.
Professor Zhao, how do you see the emergence of Beijing as a peacemaker? Will we see Beijing attempt an Israeli-Palestinian peace deal? I mean, as you mentioned earlier, Beijing wants to see more stability in the region, if nothing else, to increase its commerce with the region and to secure its access to oil and gas.
I think so. Beijing, because had a long, stable relations with both sides, just like Beijing has been doing. This is not the first time. But at the same time, this is also a very complicated issue. So it may take a longer period, because obviously it's not a one shot. By the same token, Russia, Ukraine, you can see also making a peaceful proposal now. So, China also trying to play a role.
Did you expect to see President Xi succeed in mediating between the Ukrainians and the Russians?
I would say this is just a start. It's need good timing, need good atmosphere, and need good people. And good people, I just earlier mentioned, has to be both sides trust. So now we know Zelensky is going to have a video conversation with Xi Jinping. Well, at least that's reported. So that means China started to be actively. I'm not sure. It's uncertain about result.
Zuri, China as a global mediator between the Israelis and Palestinians and the Ukrainians and the Russians. Your thoughts?
On Israel and Palestine, I'd have to say no. It's been a little bit skittish in the conflict. It doesn't have an active interest in the conflict. There's no economic benefit to the conflict. And realistically, it doesn't really give much to the Palestinian side, even though it's involved in this South-South conversation and empowering the global South, which you can make a pretty compelling argument that the Palestinian state, to the extent that it exists, is a member of the global South. So there doesn't seem to be an incentive for China to get involved. And more importantly, I think that it has interests other places, like in Ukraine. And there also, I think it's half-hearted, because while China was Ukraine's #1 trade partner ahead of the war, it has a more abiding interest in making sure its relationship with Russia endures. And if you look at the text of the peace plan, it's not really a peace plan. And it's not clear that the United States or Ukraine is ready to involve the Chinese in this dialogue.
All right. Zuri Linetsky, Shangjang Zhao, thank you both so much for coming in.
Thank you for having me.
That's my pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you. Xi and Putin's carefully choreographed diplomatic display was set against the backdrop of a growing chorus on the international stage, a rejection of US-led Western hegemony, or imperialism, as it was once called. Putin warned that the international security and cooperation architecture is, quote, being dismantled, while Xi advised that there would be no world order where the decisive word belongs to a single country. Now, after decades of unchecked American political dominance and military adventurism, a growing number of developing countries seem to agree with Xi and Putin, with a number of them, including Washington allies, seeking membership in the BRICS, the political group comprising Brazil, Russia, China, and South Africa. 5 countries representing 40% of the world's population and almost a third of its landmass. This is today's geopolitical reality. That's all from Mirida Fakhri and the team here in Washington. Thanks for watching. See you next time.